He spent 20 years in prison trying to prove that his confession to police was false and coerced. No sooner was he living the life he'd been dreaming of, free and with millions in settlement money, when he was found in a Vegas hotel room with blunt force trauma to the head. This is the story of Christopher Tapp, the exonerated man who was allegedly killed by a pro wrestler. Hi friends, I'm Katie, and this is Katie Does Crime. Thank you for joining me for the first time if you're new here, and hello to the usual rapscallions and reprobates. Please consider subscribing or joining me on Patreon if you'd like to hear more true crime stories. I first learned about Christopher Tapp on a 2018 episode of the show Wrong Man on Starz. It was a docuseries from the famed director and filmmaker Joe Berlinger. You might know him from Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel about Elisa Lam, and Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills about the West Memphis Three. His series Wrong Man looked at the cases of inmates who claim their innocence but have been in prison for decades, like Chris Tapp. In June 1996, Angie Dodge's body was found in her apartment in Idaho Falls, Idaho. The 18-year-old had been assaulted and stabbed. Authorities say she was nearly decapitated. Months went by as police investigated the crime, but then in January 1997, they arrested one of Angie's friends. And then they started interviewing more of her friends, the river rats who like to hang around the Snake River. One of these friends was Chris Tapp, who had been one of the people with Angie on the night she died. The Idaho Falls police interviewed 20-year-old Chris on January 7th and January 10th, and then asked to see him again on the 11th. His parents hired an attorney to accompany him to the third interview, but for some reason the two couldn't be there on the 11th. Chris and his lawyer would come for an interview on the 13th instead. But the police weren't having any of that sort of disrespect, so they came to the house with an arrest warrant for Chris. Chris's story changed from police interview to police interview. First, he said he didn't know anything about Angie's death.
I'm going to be straight up and truthful with you. If I did anything know about this, I would say, but I do not know. That's honest truth. I'm not lying. I'm not going to shave his ass. I'm not even trying to save my ass anymore. It's just going to bring out the truth.
Then, as the interviews wore on, he said his friend had killed her and they'd figured out an alibi together. Later, he said he'd actually been there to witness his friend kill Angie. Chris was offered immunity deals by the local prosecutors in exchange for his information. He would only be guilty of aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. The only thing is that there was DNA left on Angie, and when the results came back, it didn't belong to the friend Chris had been pointing to. So the police said, hey, why don't you just accuse your other friend instead? So he changed his story again. But of course, when the new results came back, they also didn't align with this guy. So the prosecutors ripped up the immunity deals, saying Chris was a liar. Chris was interviewed again, this time without his attorney and without the benefit of being recorded. He was taken to the scene of the crime, and his attorney apparently declined to go for some reason. Now Chris changed his story again. He said he had actually been the one to hold Angie down. He was given a polygraph test, it was actually his 5th one, and was told that the court might go easier on him if he said he only participated in the murder out of fear. So now he said he had actually been one of the people wielding a knife that night because his friend threatened to kill him if he didn't help.
Did Ben Hobbs force you to cut Angie Dodge across the right breast with a knife and said he will kill you? Yes.
Chris was charged with first-degree murder, an assault-related word I can't say on YouTube, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. His friend was never charged at all. Chris went to trial in 1998, and jurors got to hear how police lied to him in his interviews with them. They told him his friend had already implicated him and that things would be better for him if he helped them. They told him he would get the death penalty and that he only couldn't remember being part of the crime because he had repressed memories. But, of course, the police are allowed to lie. One of the officers testified that Chris knew what Angie was wearing when she was killed before ever being shown the photos of her body. But that actually wasn't true. Chris never brought up her clothes until he had been shown the photos. But, a jury is probably going to trust a cop under oath. Chris's excuse for his false confession was that he was just trying to tell the police what they wanted to hear. He was a nice young man, and he wanted to help. Chris actually had an alibi, and it was that he had been cheating on his girlfriend with another woman on the night of the murder. Not exactly the best thing to tell a jury if you're trying to convince them that you're a good guy. But maybe that makes it seem even more truthful. But other people from the River Rats testified that he was mixing up the dates. So on May 28, 1998, Chris was found guilty of all the charges against him. He got life in prison and would have to serve 40 years before he could even think about parole. Chris appealed using every argument available to him, from diminished mental capacity to lawyer ineffectiveness. In 2001, the Idaho Court of Appeals actually said they recognized that his Miranda rights had been violated during some of his police interviews, but they said no big deal, it didn't really affect anything. In 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project agreed to help Chris and were able to obtain hairs left on Angie's body for DNA testing. The testing had somehow never been done before, and wouldn't you know it, the hairs excluded Chris. But a judge said, while DNA testing may be relevant in identifying one of the assailants, such does not make it more probable that Tapp is innocent. Which, yes, I suppose is true. All it proved was that Chris didn't leave those particular hairs behind. But further testing in 2012 proved that Chris and his friend also had not left the DNA found on Angie's clothes and a teddy bear next to her. Now even Angie's mother thought Chris's conviction was dubious. She had originally thought Chris should receive the death penalty, and of course, I don't blame her for wanting justice for her daughter. But in light of this new finding, she did a 180 and actually began helping with his appeal.
Carol Dodge's impact on the case was unyielding. She never gave up on the case. She was a power. She was a force to be reckoned with it. You know, she was not going to let it go.
You know, just walking in, grabbing files. They said they had to install a door, like a Carol Dodge door, to keep her out of the case files. So, you know, she probably should have been a detective. I think she might have missed her calling.
She got in contact with a professor, an expert in false confessions, and asked him to take on the case. She had seen Chris's taped confessions, and she wasn't convinced he was guilty. In fact, she said there were times that she wanted to put her fist through the TV. This professor compiled a report on what he saw in these police interviews and told Dateline that it was the worst example of police contamination and fact-feeding he'd ever seen. He got the Innocence Project of New York and Judges for Justice involved in the appeal, too. At this point, Chris had the weight of 3 powerful organizations working against wrongful convictions at his side. In 2016, Chris's legal team filed a motion for post-conviction relief. They said his confession only came about with lies and coercion, and that worse, his made-up story about what happened couldn't even be true. Chris had claimed that Angie was killed at 1 a.m., but her friend said she was still with them at 12:30. And when she was murdered, her bladder had been full, which means she'd been asleep for hours. So she couldn't have been with friends at 12:30 a.m. and also asleep for hours by the time she was killed if Chris supposedly killed her at 1 a.m. In light of all of this, in March 2017, the local DA cut a deal. The assault was vacated and Chris was let out of prison on time served. He was a free man. Although not to, be too reasonable, the DA had to make a snide remark about how Chris was still totally guilty. The DA said, "Anyone who says the evidence proves Tapp is innocent is operating from a biased agenda or his or her own personal belief." That same year, one of the witnesses against Chris admitted that she had also been coerced by police. She had originally said that she overheard Chris and his friend talking about the murder at a party days later. She said Angie owed this friend money for meth, and that's why he killed her. But even at the time, everyone knew Angie didn't do drugs. This witness did do drugs, though, and the police had threatened to arrest her if she didn't agree to testify against Chris. She said they fed her the false story and helped her practice it before trial. And then in 2019, Angie's real killer was caught. It was thanks once again to a company I've talked about many times before, Parabon Nanolabs. The Idaho Falls police, to their credit, actually wanted to find out who committed the murder. So through the magic of genetic genealogy, Parabon was able to take a DNA sample left on Angie and create a family tree of the suspect using ancestry databases. 6 men were ruled out using the method, but there was a 7th person of interest who seemed like a good match. He was Angie's neighbor and had been looked at from the very beginning. Imagine his delight when the police only began focusing on Chris and his friend. Authorities now followed this man, 53-year-old Brian Lee Drips, and collected his discarded cigarette in 2019. Thanks to this fresh DNA, Parabon determined that the semen on Angie belonged to Drips. He confessed to the assault and murder in 2019 and said he didn't even know Chris. He had been interviewed at the time of Angie's death, but I suppose the police were distracted by wanting to pin everything on a river rat. Drips was sentenced to life in prison. At this point, even the DA had to admit that Chris was innocent. His murder conviction was completely vacated in July 2019. Chris said, "I'm so thankful that I've been given this second chance at life. I've wasted 20 years of my life for something I never did, but I also grew up over those 20 years." He found himself an exonerated man, having to make up for time lost and learning how to live in a world he hadn't seen for decades. He said the first time he tried to go shopping, just to buy normal things like a cell phone or underwear, it overwhelmed him so much that he ran out of the store. But he got a job at a factory that makes bags, he bought a new house, he got married. He got over $1 million from a new Idaho law that compensates people who were wrongfully convicted, a law that he helped get passed. In March 2021, the Idaho governor signed the Wrongful Conviction Compensation Bill into law. It makes sure that exonerees get $62,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment or $75,000 for each year on death row. In October 2020, Chris sued the city of Idaho Falls, and in June 2022, he was awarded another $11.7 million. He said, "No dollar amount could ever make up for the over 20 years of my life I spent in prison for crimes I did not commit. However, the settlement will help me move forward with my life." The mayor apologized to Chris and his mom for the harm and damages done to their family. But the happiness wouldn't last long. Chris and his wife were in the midst of a divorce in August 2023 when she died in a car crash. She was driving the Corvette he'd bought for her. He told Dateline in a September 2023 interview that the newfound money had its ups and downs. In this same interview, he said it was the last time he would ever publicly discuss Angie Dodge's murder. He didn't want to be remembered for that anymore, even if he had been exonerated. He wanted to be known for his advocacy on wrongful convictions and the work he'd done since then.
I'm just trying to be the best person I can be. I'm trying to blend the two people that I want to be together. The guy that was in prison and the guy before prison. We all make mistakes, good or bad. We may do things right or wrong, but I'm just trying to be the best person I can. Again, at the end of the day, like I've told people, and even people in prison, I told them the only thing I ever wanted was to die free.
But then in November 2023, news broke that 47-year-old Chris was dead. Like his friend Angie, he'd been murdered.
Almost half his life in prison for a wrongful conviction passed away. Christopher Tapp was 47 years old. He was convicted of rape and murder back in 1996. But years later, a team from the Innocence Project would prove that Tapp was convicted with faulty DNA evidence.
At first, police weren't saying much. We knew that Chris had been in Las Vegas for a street racing event and had died in the hospital there. Authorities first thought it was an accident that killed him. His mom said she was told he'd tripped in his hotel suite at Resorts World, fallen, hit his head on a coffee table, went into a coma, and later died. But the reports about how Chris died seemed suspicious to his family. Slipped on some slippers? Really? So they reached out to the authorities with questions soon after his funeral, and an investigation was opened. By January, the coroner was ruling his death a homicide by blunt force trauma to the head. No one knew of a motive, and no one was being called a suspect. Months went by without an update. Police eventually found text messages from people that indicated someone had punched Chris multiple times on October 29th. They even had text messages from this man's wife where she said to him, "I watched you murder somebody. Like, let that sink in, you psychopath." Finally, on March 6th, the man was arrested. 45-year-old Dan Rodimer turned himself into Clark County Police on one count of open murder. He was released that same day on $200,000 bond. He was married, a father of 6, and a college and arena football player. He was also a former wrestler who won the 2004 Tough Enough contest to join the WWE, and he had almost become a Nevada congressman in 2020. Apparently, presidential hopeful Donald Trump had tweeted his complete and total endorsement for Rodimer at the time, but it wasn't enough. Rodimer then tried to run in Texas, but came in 11th in the 2021 primary.
3 dirtiest jobs in the world: professional wrestling, politician, and bull riding. Let's go, boys!
We call that bull Nancy Pelosi. It's the beast.
Now that's Texas tough, baby. 2 out of 3 dirty jobs done. I'm Big Dan Rodimer. Texas has big problems. We need a big fighter to solve those problems. The communists in D.C. are ruining America. We have a big problem. Texas, send Big Dan to Congress. I know how to handle Nancy Pelosi and stop her bull. and I'll put a boot right in her socialist platform. Well, it looks like I already did. Men and women's bathrooms, boys and girls sports, higher taxes, higher gas prices. They're building a wall around D.C., but they're not protecting our borders. They're laughing at us. Now they're gonna try to take away our guns?
Oh, hell no!
So the story goes that Chris and Rodimer were at the same 2023 Halloween party at Resorts World Casino in Vegas. They shared a love of classic cars and racing and had gotten to know each other that way. One guest said that the party was hosted by a Formula One racing driver, and as a person who became a fan of F1 in the past few years thanks to the Netflix show, that perked up my ears. The police affidavit calls him a driver named John, and I'll let you speculate about which former driver named John was in Vegas that weekend. Chris allegedly did drugs with Rodimer's stepdaughter at this hotel suite party, and she told Rodimer about it. Chris's attorney, a family friend, says that Chris wasn't a regular drug user, but that he did have coke in his system when he died. According to one person, there were lines ready to go in the suite's master bathroom, which they were calling the fun room, and a rolled up $100 bill sitting there for anyone to use. Apparently, everyone at the party had been told that Rodimer's 21-year-old stepdaughter wasn't to be given drugs, so when she told Rodimer that Chris had been doing lines with her and her friend, Rodimer allegedly took off the fur coat he was wearing as part of his Ken Halloween costume and flew into a rage. He repeatedly attacked Chris, causing blunt force trauma and brain bleeds. A witness says Rodimer told Chris, "If you ever talk to my daughter again, I'll kill you." And then Rodimer knocked Chris to the ground, punching his head and body. Chris's head hit a table on the way down. Apparently, people at the party later saw him on a bed with his eyes open, unable to speak, and called 911. 8 News Now reports that Rodimer's wife later texted him, "I watched you nearly murder somebody, and I had to take your hands off from his neck as he laid there, and you ran away, and I spent the next 2 hours trying to take care of him. Nobody should have to watch their husband murder somebody." And this wasn't the first time Rodimer had been violent. When he was running for Congress, local news station 8 News Now asked about his wife calling 911 on him, and he said so defensively, "Yes, my wife and I got into an argument. She called the police." His wife, for her part, also sounds like a gem of a human. According to the Daily Mail, a wiretap caught him discussing the situation with her after her daughter, his stepdaughter, and her friend began cooperating with police. His wife called her daughter, model Bella Duffy, so dumb, and her friend, model Danny Lyons, the dumbest girl that ever lived on Earth. They decided Bella should tell Danny to say she knows nothing and saw nothing. You know, lie to the police. Now 22-year-old Danny will likely be one of the main witnesses against Rodimer in court. The warrant for his arrest states that Rodimer was the instigator and Chris wasn't fighting back. Danny says she left the room because what Rodimer was doing to him was so disgusting. She also claims they were already doing lines when Chris walked in. Chris didn't give the drugs to anyone. Back in October, Rodimer's wife texted him that she would help with the discovery for the case against him, gathering all of the horrible photos of the bruise marks he put on her. But her father says they're still very much married and that Rodimer did the right thing in protecting his stepdaughter by allegedly murdering the person who happened to walk in the room while she was doing drugs. Daniel Rodimer is scheduled to be in court on April 10th, 2024, and plans to vigorously contest the allegations. Chris Tapp's mom said that after his wrongful conviction, she just wants to make sure they have the right guy, which is so level-headed of her that I can't even stand it. Things don't look great for Rodimer, and I'm so glad the family followed up when Chris's death seemed suspicious to them. And I'm thankful that Angie's real killer was eventually found and that Chris was able to live a few years as a 100% innocent man. His friend said that he's not sure you can make up for 20 years lost and 7 years free, but that Chris came pretty dang close.
We lost a brother, not just a friend. We may have different blood, but that's my brother. And it's hard on everybody who knew him and loved him.
I'm happy that Chris got what he wanted, to die free. I'm only sad that it came much too soon. And I'm especially grateful for the work he did so that others won't have to go through what he did. Thank you, Chris. And thank you so much to the Innocence Project, not only for so much of the information about Chris's case, but for the work they do. As always, please let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm just a true crime fan like you are, and I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like spending this time together. I'd be so appreciative. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this has been Katie Does Crime.